sadness, repression, and taking responsibility. I encourage everybody to watch the video, as always, that starts KI Map, an introduction and overview. It's a few months old. It's on my YouTube channel, and then to watch every video after, because I'm leading you through the inside out path. And if you just watch one video out of context, I don't think that the really impact of this work will hit you. It's really when you follow along and do the work and have the context that I'm creating or expressing here. And one of the pieces of the context is, there's the general thing of taking responsibility for our own suffering, which means nobody else can fix me or save me. Teachers, facilitators, trainers, therapists, they can help, they can aid in that, but it's my responsibility to open to all of my emotions, to be emotionally honest and vulnerable, present in my relationships, not shutting down. And yeah, that's what we all want, right? But it's so difficult as humans because of repression and trauma. So there's one piece of it is just taking responsibility on the practice side. Like if there's something in the world that's upsetting me, can I go within and see, what am I believing that's creating that reaction? Am I not opening to something within myself and I'm trying to protect myself from feeling something? If I open to that and I inquire into those emotions come out, and I can then include that instead of avoiding it. That's what we mean by taking responsibility. It really just means learning KI and doing it. That's really what it means. But there's another piece of taking responsibility is when from our trauma or repression, the way that we act or don't act with other people creates its own effects. So taking responsibility is always the case in terms of practice. I don't really need a separate video for that. It just means that with trauma and repression and really awakening, it's up to you. It's your responsibility. But here, this is harder to see. This whole thing about taking responsibility for how the trauma and repression is impacting not only our lives, but our relationships. So I did a video on how taking responsibility is very difficult when you have anger as a primary repression. I won't even go into the reasons because that's that video. But here, for similar but different reasons, it's difficult for a sadness repressor or hurt repressor to take responsibility for an emotion that they've buried. Now, they're burying it to stay safe and get love. And so there are good reasons for it, like hold it back for reasons, but that has an impact. Not only is it the root of suffering for us, repression and trauma, but it has an impact directly in our relationships. So I'm in a relationship with a sadness repressor. Anger repression is always been my thing. The first thing I want to say to sadness repressors is take responsibility for the anger first. Acknowledge it. And as you learn that the anger is there to keep you safe from feeling the anger, from feeling the sadness, you might want to start expressing that to people to the extent that you can, because there's just a lot of fallout from your visible anger, right? Some sadness repressors can't express anger either. I'll talk to you guys later if you feel like all your emotions are really shut down. But generally, typically maybe, sadness repressors sometimes are more comfortable with anger. If you don't take responsibility for it, it continues to be your coping mechanism and it continues to create problems. Right on the face, visible upset that comes from avoidance creates problems. There's a deception in it. There's a bamboozle. It's like if you're coming to me with anger, I might think that that's actually your real emotion, but you're actually hurt. I can't see that. So whatever your visible anger is doing, whether it's traumatizing me or hurting other people or whatever it is, until you take responsibility for it, it'll keep happening. Because remember, it's safer for you, but your anger really isn't safe for other people, right? You might be even creating an environment that feels unsafe at times. And I'm not saying that your partner doesn't contribute to that unsafe environment. And when I say unsafe, I don't mean physically unsafe. It could just be like emotionally, it's not a safe environment when there's a lot of anger that's coming from sadness avoidance. So there's a lack of vulnerability. Whenever there's a lack of vulnerability and emotional honesty, there's an impact in some way. But the first impact that I want you to see is just how the visible anger, even though it's safer to you, is creating issues for you. And I want you to remember that you might be in a relationship with an anger repressor, some of you. So your visible anger, even though it keeps you safe, ends up being a direct trigger. Not that that's your responsibility ultimately, but can be a direct trigger for the anger repressor who's frightened of anger. So your visible anger, that might feel safer for you, is maybe frightening or intimidating somebody you're in relationship with, but that's because they're shut down around anger. They have a responsibility there too. But your responsibility is seeing, I think, the effects of how you're responding to people. What's the impact? But it's not to sit and beat yourself up. If you get into a habit of like seeing the impact and then telling the story, I'm bad, there's something wrong with me, you're actually playing into the repression in that way. Because remember, the false identity is what got developed in childhood when you couldn't be your real self and express the sadness. So if you're seeing the impact of the sadness repression on your relationship and you start just saying, oh, I'm bad, you're actually still staying safe. You're landing on an identity which for your whole life has protected you from the sadness. So even though it might feel like that's sometimes a step that we have to take, though, frankly, with sadness repression. Let me explain that. This is where it gets a little tricky. Some sadness repressors have disowned the fact that they feel like a victim, that they've been hurt. So sometimes we have to like feel that first. Like we have to feel like, no, I am hurt. I have been a victim, so that we can contact the sadness, feel it, transmute it. But if you're landing on a deficiency story like victim and it's not taking you to the repression, that's where it becomes the bypass. So if there's an impact in your relationship from the repression and you're landing on there's something wrong with me or I'm a victim, you're doing that to not go to the sadness, then it becomes a way that you bypass. It's like, it's very self-absorbed, as you notice. I'm identifying with this thing. It's all about me. There's something wrong with me, but you're not getting to the root, the sadness repression. So it's a landing there. We don't want to do that, right? That's why I've been showing you how to do repression work, because repression is what's creating that. However, for sadness repressors, if you've been avoiding a certain identity that is there, like it's already there, and you just haven't made it conscious, you're going to want to make that conscious. This is where it gets tricky. Now think about it. So I've met sadness repressors who they steer clear from the word victim or helpless, because if they were to start to acknowledge that, they would acknowledge that underneath that is this deep hurt or sadness. So when they land on helpless or victim, sometimes it's an opening if they'll go into the hurt and sadness. But if they just land there, I'm a victim, it becomes a self-protective identity. Like it keeps you from opening to the sadness, and it keeps you from being vulnerable with other people because it's not really you. You're just putting up a false front there. So what you do with ego identity really matters here for everybody. But with regard to sadness repression, the landing on it and staying there protects you from the sadness. But landing on something that gets you in touch with the sadness, and then you go to the sadness repression, that's skillful, I think. It's not a bypass, that second way. So there's the first impact, just the impact of your visible anger, or the impact of your shutdown or dissociation or numbing out, tuning out of hard adult conversations because they get too close to the hurt. That has an impact on your relationship because your partner then can't see you, right? Can't really know what's going on for you, that the impact of that. Just holding the sadness back has a major impact, not just the visible anger that comes to the surface, but the holding it back, which creates, like, again, a shutdown or dissociation. So similar to an anger repressor, a dispute happens. Let's say you get angry, but then you can't go to hurt, right? As a hurt repressor yet. So what you might go to is just like tuning out for a moment or coming up with a mind thing to protect everybody from the sadness. So you just have to watch how the repression has an impact in different ways. So again, shutting down or dissociating has a direct impact because I'm not giving my partner the real me. That has an effect on our capacity for vulnerability, openness, all that. The visible anger has an impact. All of that does. So we just want to take responsibility, but again, not to beat ourselves up. If that happens, that identity, I'm bad, I'm wrong, if anything, let it lead you back to this hurt or sadness. See, in a dispute, if you can think of what really isn't helpful is the unconsciousness. So you get angry because you're hurt, but you don't express it. Then you identify with the deficiency story, and that's distancing already. A false self is there, which is pretty focused on you and protecting you and defending, so that you're not giving your partner much in all of those scenarios. That's going to, let me just tell you what that's like. I've been on the receiving end of that. Both in anger repression and out of it, I've been on the receiving end of that. And again, what that's like is that you can only, from the point of view of somebody who's doing work, you can only go so far. Basically, you can only go so far, period, in a relationship like that, because the other person doesn't give you themselves. What they're giving you is a shutdown or a dissociation or a bunch of anger, and you just can't go beyond that. That's really difficult. If we're in a relationship with you and we have our part, it's two ways. But with regard to the impact you're bringing, it's very, very challenging to be in a relationship with somebody who is shut down around sadness. Really, really difficult, actually. You can never really get to vulnerability. You can't get to vulnerability with anger repression, not fully. That has an impact because vulnerability is key. That kind of openness is key to those really solid relationships, which are heart connected. There are so many opportunities during a dispute that a sadness repressor cannot transform that relationship because they miss those moments. And those moments are like, with the inside out that hurt or sadness is the issue, but innocently, you can't help it. You argue, and then maybe you shut down or you go somewhere else, but then you go back to anger, knowing at some point that you need to go to vulnerability, but you can't. So you just kind of go back and forth into these states that are not helpful for the relationship. I want you just to notice that. Take responsibility for how that shows up in so many different ways. Tuning out, just becoming addicted and really tuning out. Just being angry, shutting down, disconnecting, bringing a false identity to it. That's the impact that the sadness repression has in a relationship. There is a snake in the grass element with sadness repressors, similar to the anger repressors, in that when they come into the relationship, they're hiding sadness. So it's already a deception, a snaky in the grass thing, and they're going to be putting on a false self, right? So there's a snake in the grass. Like, you're not giving me yourself. And then their trigger often is the hurt or sadness, but they don't own it. So there's a deceptive quality to that. So they were getting angry. See how that snake in the grass thing, you're showing me angry, but I know you're hurt. And that quality of that snake in the grass, it affects a relationship over time in different ways. This is difficult work, but it's important if you can see what I'm saying. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be really valuable because you guys are your partners, your friends, you can start to open up to vulnerability. What do you do though if you're a sadness repressor and your partner or your mother doesn't process their trauma? Well, what I would say is never wait around for others because you could be waiting forever. And if you'll actually do the work and you start to open to vulnerability, it transforms the people around you. I've seen my husband open to vulnerability as a sadness repressor. It totally transforms the relationship. So just from him doing it, even if it weren't me, it would still have an effect because he's showing up. I mean, because I do a lot of work, but he's just showing up differently. He's aware of the impact of his trauma on this relationship. So he's speaking and expressing from the hurt and fear more. That alone, if I did no work on my own, would be transformative. So I want to encourage you not to wait around for others. And yeah, your mind might tell you, I can't show hurt because they'll pounce on me. It's not safe. I won't get love. That's just the conditioning that keeps the sadness down. You don't know any of that. What you might learn is that by being vulnerable, your relationships deepen. So it's opposite of what you're saying. It actually, you get drawn closer to someone. So your mind is scaring you. That's what it is. The truth of your experience may reveal something totally different. So Chester was probably telling the story, I can't open to sadness with Scott or anybody because I'll get hurt again, right? Fear. Totally innocent in that way. But what he's learning is by opening to vulnerability and sadness, the relationship is deepening. It's exactly opposite of what he thought. Some relationships won't survive it, to be honest with you. It won't, because you're coming out of repression. So it's almost like you, within yourself, you demand authenticity for yourself. And even if you don't demand it with others, just showing up more authentic, the other person might not be able to meet you there. They might just go back into their old patterns. And the question is do you want to stay in that? Right? That could be a hard question to ask, even if it's your mother or someone. You might say, do I want to have a relationship with my mother like this? If she's going to continue to do this, those are choices that I can't make for you. That's your life. But just know that your work is to open to it. And some relationships will deepen. Many of them will actually. And some will fall away. But were those real to begin with? If by being yourself, you lose somebody, was that based on anything that is valuable for you? Wasn't it just a trauma bond? I'm going to add one more thing in here for sadness repressors. Take responsibility for your inability to love. You're scared. I get that. Totally. I've had that. Afraid to open to love. It's trauma. But part of taking responsibility is understanding that the hurt or sadness repression has closed you off to people. You're not really opening up love and affection towards people. You can't. It's scary. Take responsibility for that piece of it when you're doing this work. Don't leave that out. Of course, reverse the sadness, hurt repression, but there's also conditioning that's protecting you. There's fear, frozen fear in your body that you're going to want to be aware of. Because that's really what's shutting you down, is the fear. The fear of being yourself, the fear of showing hurt. So I want you to take responsibility for that part too, that you're afraid. And that's going to continue to have a negative impact in your relationship if you're living from fear. So that's part of it. Take responsibility for your part. And a big part of your part is your fear of losing the other. So even though that might seem romantic, or a little bit of jealousy is nice and all that, or whatever that is, if you look, that's pure fear running and obscuring the love that is really there. You're holding on tightly to somebody, or you're trying to avoid somebody, or you're in this push-pull with them. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're afraid to get hurt, so you don't really go all in, or you go all in and you become attached because you're afraid to lose them. Take responsibility for the fear and how it's like obscuring a very natural love that you have. You just were hurt. Take responsibility for that fear. And I've given you that inquiry to take with you. For sadness repressors, I'm not afraid to lose her. What you're doing is you're bringing the fear into awareness so that what's left is that love that's not so fear-based. And that's part of taking responsibility too, is understanding for sadness repressors and anger repressors, how you brought fear into the relationship and it may be running it. And a lot of times fear looks like love, but it's not. So if I say, I never am going to leave you, I get to be with you forever. That sounds nice, very loving. But what if you're just really, really afraid? But again, you're not owning it. It's hard to tell your partner that one of the reasons that you're so committed is that you're just really terrified. But if you can put it on the table and just say, yeah, I'm really terrified. I love you, and I'm really terrified to lose you. Again, vulnerability. That has an impact on your relationship because it helps the other person know why you're acting a certain way. You know, if you don't say that, then your behavior is hard to understand sometimes. Like when the push-pull, or when like you say you want to be with me, but then you don't. Or, you know, your strong attachment to me or whoever it is. If we don't understand where it's coming from, well, the other person could just spin stories about it, coming from a lack of honesty and vulnerability. If you would just simply say, fear runs a lot for me because I have sadness repression, then when something happens, everybody knows that that's what it is. And then there's compassion, not deception, compassion, not hate or meanness, compassion, understanding. I hope that helps.